The diner and the storm. Alex sat behind the counter of his diner, eyes tracing the cracks in the floor that seemed to stretch out in all directions, each one a metaphor for his life. The faded tiles had been there for decades, just like the diner itself, but unlike the physical structure, his hope for survival had started to erode. The days of bustling traffic, people lining up for his special meatloaf, and the steady hum of conversations were now just memories. His diner, Alex's Classic Eats, had fallen victim to the tide of progress. The streets had changed. Newer, trendier spots with shiny glass windows and Instagram-worthy menus had sprouted up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and with them, his loyal customers seemed to vanish. The neon sign outside flickered in a grim parody of its former self, a sputtering, dying echo of the life that once filled the space. The dull hum of the electricity made the air feel heavy, thick with the sense of something unresolved, just like Alex's thoughts. His mind drifted over the stack of bills that sat before him on the counter, taunting him with their unrelenting presence. There was no way around it, he had to sell the diner. It was a sinking ship, and he was the last one standing, watching the waters rise. But even as the thought of selling loomed large, Alex hesitated. Who would want to buy a struggling diner in a neighborhood where even the locals seemed to have given up? The area had changed. The city had changed. And Alex had fought to hold on to his corner of the world, but now it felt like a losing battle. The prospect of selling didn't even bring the relief it should have. He had nothing left but memories, memories of late-night shifts, friendly faces, the laughter of families, and the warmth of a place that had always been a home for so many. His hand absently swiped across the counter, knocking over a few dirty mugs, and the clinking sound echoed through the otherwise quiet diner. He took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, staring at the peeling walls that had once been a bright, welcoming yellow. Now, the paint had faded and chipped, much like his spirit. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the soft sound of the rain tapping on the windows to drown out his spiraling thoughts. Then, there was movement outside. It was the slightest shift in the shadows, barely noticeable through the heavy rain, but it caught Alex's attention. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the dark alley beside the diner. He squinted through the downpour, barely able to make out the forms of two figures standing there. One was a man, tall and thin, though his posture suggested exhaustion that went beyond mere physical weariness. He was leaning against the brick wall of the alley, and beside him stood a small girl. Her face was hidden beneath the hood of a coat that was far too large for her tiny frame. She clung to her father's side, her arms wrapped tightly around his leg as though she were trying to find some small measure of comfort in the storm. The sight hit Alex harder than he anticipated. The girl's eyes were wide and frightened, her face pale from the cold, and despite the rain, she looked fragile, as though the weather might carry her away if she wasn't held together by the man beside her. Alex felt a pang of guilt gnaw at him, something raw and unfamiliar, and for a brief moment, his own troubles seemed insignificant compared to the two souls standing outside in the rain. His first impulse was to ignore them. He didn't need any more problems. The bills on the counter were proof of that. He didn't have the time or energy to take on someone else's burdens. The diner was barely surviving. What if they wanted food? What if they were dangerous? There were a million reasons not to get involved. But as he watched the girl shiver, pulling the oversized coat tighter around herself, something in his chest tightened too. It was an unspoken connection, the kind that happens when you witness someone who's just as lost as you are. Alex felt his feet move before he had fully processed the decision. He grabbed the only umbrella left behind in the corner, a ratty, faded thing, and stepped outside, his shoes splashing through the puddles. The cold hit him immediately, but his focus remained fixed on the pair in the alley. As he approached, the man looked up, and their eyes met. The man's expression was one of both surprise and reluctance, as though he hadn't expected anyone to care enough to notice them in their state. "What are you two doing out here?" Alex called, his voice cutting through the rain with a sharp edge. The man looked at him, hesitating before responding. There was a tiredness in his eyes that spoke of many long nights and uncertain days. "We're just trying to stay out of the rain," he said, his voice calm but strained. "We don't mean to cause any trouble." Alex felt a mix of emotions stirring inside him. Part of him wanted to send them on their way, tell them to go find a shelter, but that wasn't what he said. His eyes went back to the girl, her face hidden in the folds of her coat, her small body shaking from the cold. She didn't deserve to be out here in the storm, and despite his own burdens, Alex felt a pull to do something about it. "Come inside," Alex found himself saying, his voice more forceful than he intended. "You can't stay out here in this weather. It's freezing." The man blinked, surprised. "Are you sure? We don't want to impose." Alex shook his head, a flicker of annoyance rising inside him. "Just for tonight. Stay out here any longer, and the kid will catch pneumonia." He turned, walking back inside without waiting for a response. The door swung open with a creak, and Alex's heart raced as he tried to ignore the strange mix of discomfort and compassion swirling in his chest. He heard hesitant footsteps follow behind him, and a moment later, the door closed again. The warmth of the diner hit them immediately. Alex busied himself at the counter, pretending not to notice the awkwardness that followed. The man and the girl stood by the door for a moment, uncertain of their next move. "Sit wherever you like," Alex muttered, gesturing to an empty booth. The girl hesitated, glancing at her father, before they both slowly made their way to a booth in the far corner. The girl's eyes remained wide and alert, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with a mix of curiosity and wariness. The man, meanwhile, sat down opposite her, his gaze distant as if he were lost in thought. Alex didn't know what to do with himself. His usual routine of greeting customers, making small talk, and filling orders seemed foreign now. The diner was empty, save for the two newcomers. The bills were still there, waiting for him, but now there was something else weighing on him. He couldn't just go back to his usual state of waiting for customers that would never come. He had to do something. Still, as the rain beat against the windows, Alex found himself drawn to them, the man and his daughter, like they were a small flicker of warmth in the cold, much like the diner had once been for him and others. They didn't belong here, not really, but neither did he. And somehow, in this shared moment of discomfort, something unspoken passed between them. Alex forced himself to focus on the task at hand, making coffee, wiping down tables, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone in this fight. A stranger's offering. The rain continued its rhythmic dance on the windows, a constant companion to the silence in the diner. The sound of the storm outside created a cocoon of sorts, isolating the small space from the rest of the world. Inside, the warmth of the diner was a stark contrast to the cold night beyond, yet despite the comforting heat, Alex felt a strange chill. It wasn't from the weather, he couldn't quite place what it was. Mark sat at the booth with Emma beside him, though he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were focused on the table, his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of the wood. He didn't seem to know what to do with himself. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to sit still, to breathe. The chaos of the streets, of survival, had left him in a perpetual state of motion, of fight or flight. But here, in this quiet diner, a strange sense of peace washed over him. He was still tense, still afraid of what the next moment might bring, but the atmosphere in this place, humble, simple, was something he hadn't experienced in so long. Emma, for her part, seemed to relax more with each passing minute. She no longer huddled in her coat, now hanging loosely from the back of the booth. Her big, brown eyes scanned the diner, taking in the small details that most people would overlook, the old coffee machine in the corner, the peeling wallpaper, the clock that ticked loudly in the silence. It was different from the sterile, impersonal spaces she'd encountered in the city. This diner had character. She noticed the way the lights flickered above them, as if they too were struggling to stay alive. For a brief moment, Emma's face softened, her features lighting up as if she were almost happy. She had been carrying the weight of her own fears for so long, but in this space, this simple, quiet diner, she could afford to forget them, even if just for a little while. Alex moved behind the counter, trying to busy himself with cleaning up. He wiped down the counter, and when that was done, he reorganized the condiments. Anything to keep himself from thinking about the nagging feeling in his gut. His brain screamed at him to keep his distance, to remain detached, as he always had, but his body refused to listen. His eyes kept darting back to the father and daughter at the booth, and a peculiar sense of empathy grew inside him. He hadn't intended to get involved. He never did. People were complicated, messy, and the last thing he needed in his life right now was to start caring about strangers. But the longer Mark and Emma sat there, the more Alex felt himself drawn to them. The man and his daughter had said nothing about food when they first arrived. Maybe they thought it was too much to ask. Maybe they weren't used to someone offering anything without expecting something in return. Maybe they had learned to distrust acts of kindness over the years. But Alex wasn't going to let that stand. He reached for a set of eggs in the fridge, his hands moving mechanically as he cracked them into a bowl. Cooking had always been a way for him to lose himself in thought, to focus on something simple. The sizzling of the pan, the smell of butter and spices, it was a small comfort, a temporary distraction from the reality of the diner's slow death. But tonight, the act of cooking felt different. It felt like he was doing something meaningful for once, something beyond the business of survival. Mark watched him from the booth, his eyes flicking to the sizzling eggs on the stove. His stomach growled loudly, betraying the hunger he'd been too proud to admit. He hadn't eaten much today, and neither had Emma. But the thought of accepting anything from someone like Alex, a man who was clearly struggling just as much as he was, felt like too much of a burden. But the truth was, they were both exhausted, both starved, not just for food, but for a sense of normalcy, a semblance of connection. As Alex plated the eggs and slid them across the counter to the booth, his hands were steady, despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. "Eat," Alex said, his tone softer than usual, but still with that edge of practicality. "You need it more than I do." Mark hesitated, looking at the plate, and then at Alex. "We don't want to impose." "It's not imposing," Alex replied, cutting him off. "It's just food. You're welcome to it." Emma's eyes widened at the sight of the eggs. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. She was used to scavenging for scraps or settling for whatever could be found on the streets. But here, in this diner, there was something different. There was warmth, and there was the kind of food that didn't feel like a survival tactic, but like a gift. Her small fingers reached for the fork hesitantly, as if unsure she could trust it. But when she took her first bite, her face softened into something like relief. She didn't say anything, but Alex noticed the way she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth and simplicity of the meal. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt like a normal little girl again, not a child forced to grow up too quickly. Mark watched his daughter eat, and something in his chest tightened. He had wanted so badly to protect her, to give her a life free of hardship, but everything he had tried had failed. They had been on the streets for weeks now, bouncing from shelter to shelter, never staying in one place long enough to feel stable. But this moment, sitting in a warm diner with food in front of them, felt like a fleeting, precious kind of normalcy. He knew it wouldn't last, but for just a moment, it felt like they had a future. It felt like hope. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. It was a simple thing to say, but it meant more than Alex could understand. He wasn't just thanking him for the meal, but for the brief respite from the storm, for the kindness that hadn't come with strings attached. Alex nodded stiffly, unsure of how to respond. He didn't know what it was that made him want to help these strangers, but it was too late to back out now. The diner's clock ticked on in the background, and the rain continued to pour outside, but inside, for a brief moment, there was peace. It was a strange peace, filled with unspoken words and lingering questions, but it was peace nonetheless. Mark looked over at his daughter, his heart heavy with the unspoken promise to do whatever it took to keep her safe, to rebuild a life they could both be proud of. He didn't know what the future held, but for tonight, they were together, and that was enough. Emma finished her meal slowly, and then her eyes drifted up to meet Alex's for the first time. "Do you have a name?" she asked, her voice small but curious. Alex blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yeah. It's Alex," he said, managing a small smile. "Thank you, Alex," Emma said, her voice soft but sincere. I think this is the best thing that's happened to us in a long time." Alex felt his heart catch in his chest. He didn't know how to respond to that. But he didn't need to say anything. Her words lingered in the air, unspoken promises hanging between them, and for the first time in a long while, Alex allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could turn around. Unspoken bonds. The diner felt quieter now, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound that punctuated the silence between them. The rain outside had softened to a steady drizzle, its rhythmic pattern creating a tranquil backdrop that seemed to lull everyone into a brief respite. Alex wiped his hands on a rag, trying to keep himself busy, though his mind kept wandering back to Mark and Emma. It was strange. He had been surrounded by people his whole life, customers, waitstaff, even his estranged daughter, Mia, when she had lived nearby, but he had never felt the kind of connection to any of them that he felt with these two. There was something unspoken between them, a bond that went beyond the simple act of offering them shelter and food. It was as if, for all their different lives, they understood something deep down, that they were all struggling, in one way or another, to hold on. To survive. "Thank you," Mark repeated, his voice softer now, though his eyes still held that distant, weary look. "I mean it. We didn't expect this. We've been to shelters, but this feels different. No one looks at us like people there. They look at us like we're just problems to be solved." But here, his words trailed off, and he glanced at Emma, who was now quietly playing with a sugar packet she had found on the table. Alex didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to receiving gratitude, let alone from people who had so little. He had always been the one to give, to try and fix things, but this felt different. He wasn't fixing anything. He was just being. He was just there, offering a simple meal and a warm place to sit. "I don't know what else to do," Alex said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was rougher than he intended. "I'm just trying to keep this place going. I don't even know if I can. Everything's falling apart. But you too, he paused, swallowing hard. "I guess I just couldn't leave you out there in that storm." Mark nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Alex's face. "It's not easy, you know," he said quietly. "Life. Trying to make things work. I used to have a job. A decent one, too. But one thing led to another, and I lost it. My wife, she got sick. We didn't have the money for treatment. We lost everything." His voice broke slightly, but he quickly regained control, his face hardening as if to shield himself from the vulnerability he had just shown. "I've been trying to make it work for her. For Emma. I'll do whatever it takes." Alex felt a tightness in his chest as Mark spoke. He had heard stories like this before, from regulars who had come and gone. People struggling, people falling through the cracks. But hearing it firsthand, hearing Mark's raw emotion, hit Alex harder than he had anticipated. He could see it in Mark's face, the desperation, the shame, the guilt. But there was also love. Deep, undying love for his daughter. It was the kind of love that made a person do whatever it took to survive, even when survival seemed impossible. "I get it," Alex said quietly, his voice low. "I've been there too. Not exactly the same, but I know what it's like to have everything slip through your fingers. You hold on as tight as you can, but it all just keeps slipping away. He hesitated before continuing, not used to opening up like this. I used to have a family. A wife, a daughter. But I screwed it up. I wasn't there when they needed me. My daughter, she left. She went off to college, and she never came back. His voice softened, and his gaze fell to the counter. I pushed her away. I didn't even realize it at the time, but it happened. And now, I'm here. Alone. For a moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath, as if time itself had paused to allow the weight of their shared silence to settle. Mark nodded in understanding. He didn't need Alex to say more. He had heard the unspoken words, the regrets, the pain. He knew what it was like to lose someone you loved. You're not alone, Mark said quietly. His voice was gentle but firm. Not right now. Not here. Alex looked up, meeting Mark's gaze. The weight of the words hung in the air, heavy and true. It was the kind of statement that held no expectation, no strings attached, just a quiet acknowledgement of the shared human experience. They were both trying to hold on to something, to make sense of the wreckage of their lives. Emma had been quietly playing with her sugar packet, but now she looked up at them, her eyes wide and serious for someone so young. Are you going to fix the diner, Mr. Alex? She asked, her voice small but full of curiosity. Alex blinked in surprise at the question. It was such an innocent thing to ask, yet it struck him like a blow to the chest. His first instinct was to brush it off, to tell her that it wasn't something to worry about, but when he looked at her, at this little girl who had been through so much, who had so little, he found himself pausing. I don't know, Alex said quietly. Maybe. I've been thinking about it, but, he trailed off, unsure of how to explain the depths of his uncertainty. It's hard to fix something when you don't know where to start. Mark's eyes softened, and he gave a small, understanding nod. You'll find a way, he said. You just have to keep trying. No matter what. Alex stared at Mark for a moment, the simplicity of the words settling in his chest. He hadn't expected this kind of encouragement, not from a stranger. But there it was, quiet, grounded wisdom. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything at once. Maybe it was about taking small steps, finding a way to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. I hope you're right, Alex said, his voice quieter than before. I really do. The clock ticked on in the background, but for once, it didn't feel like the seconds were slipping away. It felt like time had slowed, like they had all found a brief moment of stillness, a rare instance where things didn't feel quite so broken. Mark glanced at Emma, and she offered him a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt like maybe things could get better. Not overnight, not with some grand gesture, but with small acts of kindness, small moments of connection. Emma got up from the booth and walked over to the counter, her steps light and quick. She reached for one of the napkins and carefully wrote something on it. Then, without a word, she handed it to Alex. It was simple, just a drawing of the diner, with the words, "Good luck, Mr. Alex," written underneath it. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He looked down at the napkin, the small drawing of a smiling face and a diner filled with warmth. It was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a long time. Thank you, Emma, Alex said, his voice thick with emotion. He placed the napkin gently on the counter, careful not to crumple it. I think I needed that more than you know. Mark smiled softly, watching the interaction between his daughter and Alex. For a brief moment, he felt like they had found a piece of something that might just help them rebuild. And as Alex placed the napkin on the counter, Mark knew that despite everything, maybe, just maybe, they were all a little bit closer to finding their way home. The quiet struggles. The days passed in a haze for Alex. He had always been the kind of person who worked with his hands, whose world revolved around the tangible: meals served, customers satisfied, the hum of the diner's energy. But these days, the diner felt more like an anchor than a sanctuary. Every corner of the place reminded him of what he was losing. Yet there was something about the presence of Mark and Emma that kept him from sinking too deep into despair. They didn't say much, but their quiet resilience spoke louder than anything Alex could have put into words. Mark's struggle was evident in the way he carried himself, never fully relaxing, always alert, always bracing for the next wave. He spent his days pacing the sidewalks, looking for odd jobs, trying to earn whatever he could to keep a roof over their heads. But he had learned quickly that the world wasn't kind to people like him. The more he tried to prove his worth, the more the doors seemed to close. The rejection, the cold stares, it wore him down slowly, piece by piece. But every evening, after hours of searching for work, he would return to the diner, sit at the same booth, and watch Emma, who seemed to grow stronger by the day. She had blossomed in a way that Alex never could have anticipated. The little girl who had once been so timid, who had barely spoken a word when she first arrived, was beginning to show glimpses of her vibrant spirit again. She would sit at the counter, drawing pictures, or fidgeting with whatever she could find. And slowly, as the days went by, Alex realized that the diner was starting to feel a little less like a place of escape and more like a home. Mark had told him once, after a long day, that he didn't know how to repay the kindness Alex had shown them. Alex had waved it off, as he always did. But that night, he found himself thinking about it long after they had gone. He wasn't just helping them survive the storm. He was helping them rebuild, giving them a foundation to stand on when everything else had crumbled away. And in some strange way, they were doing the same for him. One evening, as the last light of the day faded behind the clouds and the diner was empty except for the three of them, Mark spoke again. He was always so guarded, so careful with his words, but there was a quiet desperation in his voice this time that Alex hadn't heard before. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Mark said, his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. "I'm trying, Alex. I'm really trying. But I keep hitting dead ends. I can't even get a decent meal for Emma most days. And I'm ashamed of it. I should be doing better for her. I don't want her to see me like this." Alex looked at Mark, studying him carefully. There was a depth to his pain that Alex understood all too well. The weight of being a parent, the responsibility of keeping your child safe and healthy, it was a heavy burden. And Mark was carrying it alone, doing the best he could, but his weariness was visible. "You're doing what you can," Alex said quietly. "That's all anyone can ask of you." But Mark shook his head, his eyes brimming with frustration. "I can't just keep hoping things will get better. Every day it's a struggle. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. I don't want to fail her." Alex sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always been a fixer, a problem solver. It was how he had survived all these years, how he had kept the diner running in a world that no longer seemed to value it. But fixing Mark's life wasn't as simple as cooking a meal or cleaning a table. He couldn't just offer the kind of solution that made everything okay. Life wasn't that easy. But still, Alex couldn't ignore the pull he felt to help. "You're not failing her," Alex said, his voice steady. "You're doing your best. And that's all anyone can do. Sometimes life isn't about fixing everything all at once. It's about showing up. Just keep showing up. For her, for yourself. And I'll show up too." Mark's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to let the walls down, just a little. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear those words. Maybe he had been holding on to the idea of being perfect, of having all the answers. But life had taught him a harsh lesson: perfection didn't exist. And maybe that was okay. Alex leaned forward, his mind turning. "You know, "I could use some help around here," he said, breaking the silence. "This place could use an extra pair of hands. Maybe you could help me out with the dishes, or the deliveries. I'm not asking for much, just enough to keep things moving. It might not be much, but it's something. And if you're interested, maybe we could even find a way to make it work for you." Mark looked at Alex, the weight of the offer settling in his chest. He hadn't expected Alex to offer him work, especially in his own diner, especially after everything that had happened. But there was something in Alex's tone that made him believe it wasn't just about the work, it was about the connection. It was a lifeline, and for once, Mark wasn't too proud to grab hold of it. "I'd appreciate that," Mark said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you. I won't let you down." "Don't thank me yet," Alex said with a small, wry smile. "You've still got to survive the world of dishwashing." They both chuckled lightly, the tension easing just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a step toward something better. And as the days passed, Mark took on more responsibilities at the diner. He washed dishes, helped with the deliveries, and even began offering his own small suggestions for improving the menu. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And it was real. Emma, too, had found her place in the diner. She would sometimes sit at the counter, drawing pictures for Alex or helping him organize the kitchen. It was small, simple tasks, but they gave her a sense of purpose, something to hold on to in a world that had shown her little kindness up until now. Over time, the diner began to feel like more than just a place to eat. It became a community. The customers who still came in for their daily meals started to notice the change. They saw Mark and Emma, and there was something in the way they all interacted, something that made the diner feel warmer, more alive. Alex noticed the change, too. The meals were still as hearty as ever, but now, there was a quiet kind of love woven into everything. The meals weren't just food, they were a symbol of survival, of hope. And slowly, the diner began to feel like a home again. One evening, after a long day, Alex stepped outside to take a breather. He stood under the flickering neon sign, staring out into the street. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and glistening in the dim light. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. Things weren't perfect. But maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to get better. As he stood there, a figure appeared in the doorway of the diner. It was Mark, standing with Emma at his side. Mark nodded at Alex, and for the first time, Alex saw a spark of something new in his eyes, hope. And in that moment, Alex realized that maybe he wasn't just saving them after all. Maybe they were saving him, too. A new beginning. The weeks passed slowly but steadily, like the gentle drip of water from a leaky faucet. The diner had found a rhythm, a heartbeat of its own, and Alex had begun to feel something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of purpose. He had always prided himself on his work ethic, on his ability to make things run smoothly, but the addition of Mark and Emma had brought something to the diner that he hadn't realized it had been missing. There was a warmth in their presence, a quiet strength in the way they carried themselves. Slowly, it was as if the diner was beginning to come alive again. Mark had found his place. He wasn't the kind of person to sit idly by, he worked hard, putting in the long hours, washing dishes, prepping food, doing whatever was needed. But it wasn't just the physical work that made a difference, it was the way he showed up. Every day, he brought with him a sense of gratitude that made Alex appreciate the simplest of things. Mark didn't take anything for granted. He had always been a man of few words, but now there was something different about him. There was a quiet pride in the way he moved around the diner, setting the tables, making sure everything was just so. And every time Alex saw him interacting with Emma, it made him want to do better. To keep fighting, to keep pushing. Emma, too, had grown in ways Alex hadn't expected. The shy, timid girl who had once barely spoken was now the heart of the diner. She would help Alex with the small tasks, her fingers moving quickly as she arranged condiments or refilled sugar packets. She had an eye for detail, and though she was only 11, she already had a sense of responsibility that amazed Alex. There was a fire in her that burned bright, even in the face of everything she had been through. And it was contagious. Slowly, Emma's presence had started to shift the atmosphere of the diner, making it feel more like a community than a business. Customers who once came in out of routine now lingered longer, drawn in by the unspoken warmth that filled the air. One afternoon, after the lunch rush had passed, Mark took a seat at the counter, his face etched with exhaustion. He had been out all morning, looking for odd jobs, but once again, the world had turned its back on him. It was the same story. No one wanted to hire a man who had been out of work for too long. No one wanted to hire someone who didn't fit the mold. Alex noticed the slump in Mark's shoulders, the way his eyes were clouded with frustration. He had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who was worn thin, who had fought so many battles that he no longer knew how to keep going. But it was also the look of someone who wasn't giving up. "You all right?" Alex asked, wiping down the counter. Mark shrugged, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. Same old," he said, his voice low. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I've been out there, asking for work for hours, and all I've gotten is a bunch of no's. I'm trying, Alex. But it's like I'm invisible." Alex leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. He knew what that felt like. It wasn't just about finding a job, it was about finding a way to be seen again, to feel like you mattered. Alex had been there too. He had been on the receiving end of rejection, of doors slamming in his face. He knew how it felt to be ignored, to feel like you were just one more name in a long list of people who didn't have a place in the world. "You're not invisible," Alex said quietly. "I see you. I see what you're doing. And that's more than a lot of people can say. It's not about the no's, Mark. It's about the fact that you keep showing up. That's what matters." Mark looked up at him, his eyes clouded with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of something there. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was a small spark that had been buried for far too long. He nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the cup. "Thanks," he said, his voice rough. "I needed to hear that." The moment was interrupted by a soft voice from across the room. "Hey, Mr. Alex." Emma called, looking up from her seat at the counter. She had a piece of paper in front of her, a small drawing that she had been working on for the past few minutes. "I made you something." Alex raised an eyebrow as he walked over to her. "What is it?" Emma smiled up at him, her eyes gleaming with pride. She handed him the drawing, which was a simple picture of the diner, but with a twist. Alex's face was drawn in the window, smiling back at her. There were little hearts scattered around the outside of the diner, and the words, "Home," were written in bold letters at the top. Alex felt something swell inside him as he looked at the drawing. It was just a small piece of paper, but it meant more than he could express. This was more than just a drawing of a diner. It was a symbol of everything they had been through together, the kindness, the warmth, the sense of belonging that they had created in this small, humble place. For the first time in what felt like years, Alex felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And it wasn't just because of the diner. It was because of the people he had found here. "Thank you, Emma," Alex said softly, his voice thick with emotion. This is the best gift I could ever ask for." Emma beamed, clearly pleased with herself. "I thought it would make you smile," she said, her voice full of pride. It did more than that. It made Alex feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, hope. It made him believe, just for a moment, that maybe things could get better. That maybe he wasn't alone in this fight. As the days went on, the diner began to take on a new life. Word spread that Alex's Classic Eats wasn't just a place for food, it was a place for people. It was a place where strangers became friends, where kindness was exchanged, where you didn't have to pretend to be something you weren't. It became a home, not just for Alex, Mark, and Emma, but for the community that had been craving something real, something meaningful. And as much as Alex had once feared the idea of failure, of losing everything, he now realized that sometimes, losing everything was just the beginning of something new. It wasn't about how many customers came through the door, or how much money he made. It was about the connections he made, the lives he touched. It was about showing up for the people who needed him, just as they had shown up for him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Alex wasn't afraid of it. He knew that whatever happened, he wasn't alone. He had Mark. He had Emma. And together, they would figure it out. The diner wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It was a place where new beginnings were born, one small moment at a time, full circle. The diner had changed in ways Alex hadn't expected. Not just in terms of business, although that had improved too, but in the way it felt. It no longer felt like a place just trying to survive. It felt like a place that thrived, quietly, humbly, but with purpose. Customers came in, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The food was still the same, hearty, familiar, comforting, but it was the energy in the air that was different. There was a warmth, a sense of belonging that Alex hadn't realized had been missing for so long. The outside world seemed to fade away as the diner continued to provide refuge, not just from the cold, but from the noise of life. It was a rare thing to find a space where people could come together and leave their worries at the door, even if just for a while. And that was what Alex had created without even realizing it, a space where healing could happen, where people could start over, and where everyone had a seat at the table. Mark had become an integral part of the diner, but more than that, he had become part of Alex's life. The two men didn't talk about their pasts often. They didn't need to. Their unspoken bond was based on something more primal, survival. They both understood the weight of responsibility, the burden of looking out for someone who depended on you, and the quiet desperation that came with wanting to do better. Mark had made strides, finding more consistent work through the diner and even picking up odd jobs around town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And slowly, as he worked alongside Alex, he began to rediscover the man he used to be, the man who could be relied upon, who could stand tall in the face of adversity. It wasn't about perfection, about being everything to everyone, it was about doing what you could with the little you had and making the most of it. Emma, too, had blossomed in ways that both Alex and Mark could never have anticipated. She was no longer the frightened little girl who had clung to her father's side. She had become more confident, more outgoing, and more resilient. There were still moments when her eyes would flash with the vulnerability of her past, but more and more, she found herself smiling, genuinely, freely. The diner had become her sanctuary, her space to be herself. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky and the diner was quieter than usual, Alex found himself sitting in the booth, a cup of coffee in hand, staring out at the street. The hustle and bustle of the city had become just a background noise to his life. He wasn't trying to keep up with it anymore. He didn't need to. There was something about this moment, about the stillness, that made him realize how far they had come. He had fought for so long to hold on to something that felt like it was slipping away. But now, after everything that had happened, after all the challenges they had faced together, Alex realized that what they had built wasn't just a diner, it was a family. And family wasn't defined by blood. It was defined by the people who chose to show up, day after day, and make each other's lives better. Mr. Alex? Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood at the counter, holding a piece of paper in her hands. I made another drawing for you. Alex smiled at the sight of her and walked over to her. What do you have this time? He asked, kneeling down to meet her eye level. Emma handed him the paper, and Alex took it with care. It was another drawing of the diner, but this time, there was a noticeable change. The picture showed Alex, Mark, and Emma standing together in front of the diner. Their faces were drawn with love, with the small details that made them who they were, the smile on Alex's face, the determined look in Mark's eyes, and the joy that Emma exuded. Above their heads was the same word from the previous drawing, home. Alex's heart swelled as he looked at it. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a statement. A declaration that, despite all the odds, they had created something beautiful together. And in that moment, Alex knew that no matter what the future held, they had already won. "Thank you, Emma," Alex said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." Emma beamed at him, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm glad you like it," she said, her voice small but full of hope. "You're the best, Mr. Alex." Alex's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard. He had never been great with words. But this was something he could never put into words. This small act of kindness, this little drawing, spoke volumes. It was proof that even the smallest gestures could create ripples of change in the world. And for Emma, it was a way of saying, without saying it, that she finally felt like she belonged. Mark came out from the back of the diner, wiping his hands on his apron, a small smile on his face as he approached the counter. He had heard the conversation between Emma and Alex, and though he said nothing, there was a deep sense of pride in his eyes. He hadn't always been the best father. He hadn't always had the answers. But now, as he stood beside Emma, as he watched Alex hold the drawing in his hands, he realized that he had done something right. "We're doing all right, aren't we?" Mark said quietly, looking between Alex and Emma. Alex nodded, his smile faint but sincere. "Yeah, we are." Mark's eyes softened, and for a moment, he let himself fully appreciate the change in their lives. They had all come a long way from that rainy night when they had first walked into the diner, looking for shelter from the storm. Now, there was a new kind of storm on the horizon, one that was more hopeful, more filled with possibility. It wasn't going to be easy. Life rarely was. But for the first time, Mark felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was living. "You know," Mark said, his voice quieter now, "I think this place is more than just a diner. It's something more." Alex turned to him, his gaze thoughtful. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, "I think you're right." The sound of the door opening interrupted them, and a few familiar faces stepped inside. Regular customers, people who had been coming to Alex's diner for years, were slowly returning. The quiet hum of chatter filled the air, and for a moment, Alex couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. This was what he had fought for, this sense of connection, this sense of community. It wasn't about the food or the business. It was about the people. As the night wore on and the diner filled with the steady buzz of conversation, Alex, Mark, and Emma stood together behind the counter, working as a team. It was small, it was humble, but it was theirs. They had built something together, something that no one could take away from them. In the end, it wasn't about the diner. It was about the people who came through the door, the ones who needed a place to rest, a place to be seen, a place to feel at home. And in that sense, Alex had already created something more meaningful than he could ever have imagined. The future was still uncertain, but Alex had learned that sometimes, the best things in life came not from the big, grand gestures, but from the small, quiet moments of connection, of showing up, and of choosing to love. Together, they were more than just survivors. They were a family.